Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the American Academy in Rome Conversation Series. For those of you new to us, I'm Mark Robbins, President of the American Academy in Rome. The Academy, as many of you know, is a unique institution that supports American artists and scholars to come and live in a community in Rome, to do their projects with the deep presence of Rome at their doorsteps, literally. This is the fourth of our virtual programs, and if there's an upside to doing this work virtually, it's the expansion of our audiences to allow more people to join us for these talks and to share in the kinds of ideas that happen every day at the Academy. Today's dialogue is called the Pergamon Panorama in Berlin, where tradition and innovation converge, which again seems apt for the Academy. This talk will feature Andreas Scholl, director of the Antikensammlung in Berlin, and Lynne Lancaster, the Academy's Andrew W. Mellon Humanities professor. You may remember the exhibition of the Pergamon artifacts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2016, in a wonderful tour that was led by Sean Hemingway, one of our fellows who's a curator at the Met. And looking at the array of physical artifacts from Pergamon, you realize the weight of history, but also the achievement of transporting this material across countries. And so to think about this at this scale of Pergamon, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, it overshadows the Areopagus, which looks quite small in comparison, or even the Temple of Den-Dur here at the Metropolitan. What they share is this wonderful case in which an entire structure, or a good deal of a structure, is housed within another piece of architecture. Like a Russian doll, it's a shell within a shell that raises ideas for us about not only scale, but provenance and meaning. And it makes us think about the transposition of knowledge across history. So Andreas will speak about the Pergamon Panorama in Berlin, a project that takes the 19th century format of the cyclorama, itself innovative in its own day, and combines this with digital technology to recreate the experience of the ancient city. This is something which is significant in today's archaeological practice as it is across history. A few notes for you. Lynne Lancaster will introduce Andreas, who will give a short presentation about the project. We'll then have a discussion, which will be followed by Q&A. Those of you who have joined us before will notice a slight difference. We've moved to a webinar format, and so unfortunately we won't be able to see each of you on the screen, but for Q&A, because we invite questions at the end of this presentation, send your questions to the host, who will then transmit them to our speakers. And I'll see you briefly right after the Q&A. But now on to the program. I'd like to introduce Lynne Lancaster, who is known to many of you, an archaeologist, architectural historian, and educator, as well as a 2002 fellow at the American Academy. And Lynne is currently in her third year. It's gone so quickly, Lynne. And unfortunately her last year as the Mellon professor. Lynne was professor and chair of the Department of Classics and World Religions at Ohio University. She received a BA from VPI and a master's in philosophy in classical archaeology from Oxford, as well as a PhD in classical archaeology from Oxford. We've been delighted to have her as Mellon professor for this time. Her deep understanding, knowledge, and passion for Rome has been contagious, perhaps a bad word choice, contagious as humanities professor. her excitement and dedication to the broader community is evident, and she is consistently overbooked on her walks and talks into the city of Rome, both scholars and artists within the community looking forward to hearing Lynne really unpack the complexity of history in Rome. So with that, I would like to turn the reins over to Lynne for her to do the introduction of Andreas, and I will see you all shortly. Lynne.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I'm delighted to introduce our guest tonight, Andreas Scholl, who is the director of the Antikensammlung in Berlin, basically the collection of classical antiquities, which includes the Pergamon Museum. He himself is a specialist in Greek sculpture, having written his dissertation on the reliefs on Attic grave stelae while at Westphalian Wilhelm's University of Munster, and he also studied at the University of London. He's gone on to publish the Erechtheion on the Acropolis and on sculptures from German excavations at Miletus. In 2000, he began as curator of sculpture at the Antikensammlung in Berlin, and since 2003 has served as its director while also teaching at the Freie Universität in Berlin. As director of the Antikensammlung, Professor Scholl was instrumental in forming the collaboration with the architect Yadigar Assisi for the 2011 exhibit on the Pergamon collection, and that's the one that eventually went to New York. The German Archeological Institute has been excavating at Pergamon for over 140 years, and the exhibit was meant to bring together works of art found there. But in addition, they had the idea to provide the visitor with an immersive experience of the city of Pergamon via Assisi's 360-degree reconstruction, which was based on the popular 19th century panoramas, but it incorporated new visualizing technologies. After the great success in 2011, they again teamed up to create a permanent version of the Pergamon Panorama while the Pergamon Museum is closed for restoration. And that is one that I saw in 2018. And ever since I went there, I had been dying to get Andreas. I wanted to get him physically in Rome, but alas, COVID happened. But he has been generous to share his expertise from Berlin while it is on lockdown. So Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, dear Lynne, dear Mark, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to the audience of the American Academy in Rome from Berlin. Lynne has already given an excellent introduction into the topic. Please, before I get into the exhibition hall and show you the panorama, I would like to stress some archaeological hard facts. Lynne already said that the excavation was started in the late 19th century. Actually, the first finds were made by the German railway engineer Karl Humann from Essen in the 1871. That's the year when the German Reich was founded. And it took Alexander Constantine 7 years to get the permissions to excavate there. There are many finds came actually to Berlin on the basis of the division of finds between the Ottoman Empire and the German Reich, and they were instrumental in building up this unique collection of Hellenistic sculpture on one side and marvelous pieces of Hellenistic and Roman architecture on the other side. In 1901, the first Pergamon museum was actually built. Most people don't know anything about it because it was pulled down after 7 years because its foundations were too weak, and it was replaced by the monumental building many of you, I guess, will have already seen, the famous Pergamon Museum, which is absolutely unique as a museum as it tries to display, to show Greek and Roman architecture, but also Islamic architecture and architecture from the Near East in a one-to-one scale, mainly focusing on architectural exhibits. This museum worked for only 9 years between 1930 and 1939. The Second World War came, it was destroyed. Its exhibits were dispersed almost all over Europe. Luckily, most of the things taken to the Soviet Union returned between 1958 and 1959. The building itself was actually never finished. The Cold War came, the separation of Germany. There were never the resources to keep it updated in terms of technology. And now we have the unique chance since 2013 to renovate the building and to supplement it by a fourth wing to have finally a circuit tour of the collections. Lynne already mentioned our first exhibition on our first big monographic exhibition on Pergamon in 2011, 2012. This was actually, after more than a century, the first attempt to give a full idea of the holdings from Pergamon, which came to Berlin. Then in 2013, we started the big building operation of renovating the building. Initially, we thought we might finish the first phase around 2020-21. Now it will not be ready before 2025 or 2026. This means the Pergamon altar is not visible for more than a decade. My colleagues and I in the collection of classical antiquities felt very ashamed about this fact, and this is why we used this exhibition, of which parts were spectacularly shown in the Metropolitan, a marvelous exhibition. We used the core of this exhibition for a new semi-permanent display, which I'm now going to talk about, which combines major Hellenistic originals from Pergamon and panorama designed by Yadigar Assisi with archaeological help from our side. Perhaps I should mention that Pergamon is unique in many ways. It's especially unique because it was the metropolis of a very successful Hellenistic dynasty, the Attalids, flourishing mainly in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. And archaeologically, it's so remarkable because the Acropolis was never really built over after antiquity. So the situation is totally different from other famous Hellenistic cities. It was ideal to excavate, as you know, not just the Pergamon altar, other famous buildings were excavated and were reconstructed. Perhaps by now we should start my presentation. Perfect, thank you very much. I start with a spectacular view from the roof, from the top of the panorama. You see the tower, the 15-meter high tower, which has 3 levels from which the visitor can view a 360-degree panorama of Pergamon as an ancient metropolis. Those of you familiar with Pergamon will recognize that we choose the 2nd century AD as the time in which to show Pergamon, because in that century, the Trianaeum, the temple for the Roman imperial cult, was finished on the highest point of the Acropolis of Pergamon, so to say, as a crown of completing this spectacular setting of a Hellenistic and Roman city. Here you see the exhibition, the purpose-built exhibition hall right beside the Berlin Museum Island, many of whom will have been here, I guess. It's right opposite the Bode Museum. It's 115 meters long, 15 meters wide, 8 meters high. And you see behind it and actually cutting into this hall, the 30-meter high rotunda specifically built to present Yadigar Assisi's panorama. It took us quite an effort to raise the money, several million euros to build it. And it was quite unfortunate that there was a big gap between the closure of the Hall of the Pergamon altar in September 2014 and the opening of this building in November 2018. But now we are very lucky to have it because it replaces the otherwise not visible topic of Pergamon, which is the name giver for our museum, obviously. And so we are happy and proud that we now can serve the public with the most spectacular artworks from Pergamon. Yes, we introduced our visitor in the exhibition surrounding the panorama by giving him an idea of what Pergamon was, how the excavation went, as I said, already started in 1878. And Lynne already said that only interrupted by the 2 world wars. It's continuing with the support of the Turkish government until the present day. And I think it's fair to say that this has been one of the most successful excavations in the whole of classical archaeology. We talk about the excavation, we talk about the building of the 2 museums, and we talk about the plans for a future Pergamon museum, which will, with a 2nd phase, not be finished before 2030, I guess, which would be a very fitting date because that would be the centenary of the opening of the Pergamon Museum. Our entire exhibition is labeled in English and German. We use digital media. We show historic photographs. We show films. We show computer animated walks through the museum as it will look like from 2030 onwards. The visitor is greeted by marvelous female over life-size statues, all found around the courtyard surrounding the Pergamon altar. All the sculptures, of which many have never been on public display before, were restored, cleaned, and for the first time since Franz Winter's famous publication in the Pergamon excavation series from the early 20th century, we have published all these material now in a monumental new catalog, which came with the first Pergamon exhibition in 2011. It was an idea by Assisi, not just to display these sculptures in beautiful lighting, but he invented a computer-controlled situation where the light keeps changing constantly, simply to show to the visitor that the ancient viewer would experience these sculptures in a constantly changing way, from early morning to late evening. And it's an installation which runs over several minutes so that you can get an idea how differently the sculptures would look in different lighting. Assisi, who is not just a panorama artist, he's also a marvelous painter and draftsman. He contributed several very instructive reconstruction drawings in changing style. Here in the, more or less looking like a drawing from the late 19th century, he shows how these statues might have been presented in the temenos, in the sanctuary surrounding the famous altar of Zeus in Pergamon. While we were working on these sculptures, of course, new discoveries were made. This fabulous statue, most likely of a nymph, was reconstructed from small fragments which already had been hacked to pieces in antiquity, clearly to be burned to lime afterwards. And using this piece and its several stages of restoration from the late 19th century onwards, we show how the attitudes in archaeology changed towards restoration. Another view of this monumental group of Pergamenian ladies. In some cases, we don't know exactly whom they represent. Some are clearly personifications of abstract things like tragedy. Others are most likely to be honorific statues for priestesses or honorable citizens of Pergamon. Unfortunately, no case the base with the inscription, with the dedicatory inscription, is preserved, so that we can't be sure in most cases whom they represent. In the center, we see this nymph, and she was most likely holding a baby boy, which we found in our storerooms. Same marble, the scale is absolutely fitting, and there are very close comparisons with Hellenistic terracottas, possibly. So we think that more than 90% that this might actually belong to this lady. Here you see that I was talking about this changing lighting. I talked about the sense, and for someone who's interested in the effect the ancient sculptures made in varying sunlight, varying lighting situations, I think this is quite an interesting experience which you do not have in a normal museum. Another view of this installation here to the right, the famous beautiful head from Pergamon, which impressed our last emperor, William II. He wanted to have the piece reconstructed, but this was happily done only on a cast. Of course, most people still think that ancient marble sculpture was just white or gray, and we chose here a new technology to demonstrate that this was not the case. We found lots of microscopic traces of color on the Pergamon sculptures, and Assisi and his team reconstructed with our help one of the originals, of course not by painting it, but by beaming colored light onto this lady, which also comes from the courtyard of the Pergamon altar. It's not just monochrome. You can see that ornaments are shown here. So I think people get a very vivid idea of how the interplay between paint and marble might have worked on an Hellenistic original. I think that's quite a good progress towards painting casts like it was done since the late 19th century, and as it was done for Vincent Brinkmann's famous exhibition on the colored gods, which also traveled to the United States. Here in the background, you see one of the most beautiful pieces in the show, clearly a Pergamene queen wearing the royal diadem. And after this introduction into the art, mainly the sculpture of Pergamon, explaining what the historical background was, that the Pergamene kings were incredibly rich because they had got hold of Alexander's treasure, and they made two major investments. They bought mercenaries and enlarged the empire, and they heavily invested into culture in the broadest sense. They adorned their marvelous Acropolis with buildings. They brought famous intellectuals to Pergamon, clearly with the idea to make Pergamon a second Athens. This can be proven by direct quotations from the Parthenon marbles and the Great Frieze, and many other things. As you know, they were present in Athens itself with monumental votive offerings, the Stoa of Attalos and the Agora reconstructed by the American school, also on the south slope of the Acropolis, the Stoa of Humanities, and many big votive offerings on the Acropolis itself. So they linked themselves to Athens in a very direct and very successful way. Now the visitors entering the panorama, you see the tower at the center. The building is 30 meters high and has a diameter of more than 30 meters. And you see the totally distorted panorama. And the proper view, the proper angle to view it is, of course, from the top of the tower. It's 15 or 16 meters high. You see all the lighting, which is fixed on the outside of the tower. It's all, of course, computer controlled, so we can display the panorama in a never-ending day and night sequence. And there is, as you will experience at the end of my little talk, there is also soundtrack to it, which gives a very emotional touch to the whole presentation. Yes, you walk up a stair. There are 3 different viewing levels, which allow the visitor to experience the panorama 360 degrees, but also you can look at many details more closely from the different levels. Yes, we are still here on the ground floor, looking at the reconstruction of the famous altar of Zeus from Pergamon, which, as you know, is only partially reconstructed one-to-one in the Pergamon Museum itself. Here we used, of course, the chance to reconstruct the building according to the most recent knowledge. This brings me to the point of explaining how the panorama was actually created. It was Assisi's idea. He is the reinventor of the famous 19th century panorama, which were present in all big European and I guess also in many big North American cities. And this medium, which flourished in Germany between 1800 and the late 19th century, was more or less the same all over Europe, was of course very efficiently killed by the invention of the silent movie. They disappeared within years. In Europe, there are only 4 original panoramas left. Assisi realized already in the 90s that new digital technology would help to create much more monumental panoramas. And he approached the topic in different formats with totally different topics. He was instrumental in putting up a large exhibition on the history of the panorama in Bonn in the early 1990s, when the big Kunst- und Ausstellungshalle of the Federal Republic of Germany was opened there. So he is the expert, and in 2006 he approached us and asking whether we would be interested to create a Pergamon panorama. There is a fantastic historic reference to that in our history, because in 1886 there had already been a 180-degree panorama created then by the excavators themselves to present to the Berlin public how Pergamon might have looked like. What was a very beautiful coincidence is the fact that at the same time we were asked, we were planning this exhibition, which was finally shown in 2011 and 12 for an entire year. So we very rapidly agreed to cooperate. Assisi was willing to pay for the panorama and the building itself. We paid for the exhibitions. We had, of course, to convince our bosses to do that because it was a very costly undertaking. Assisi gave his entire artistic experience, and we gave the archaeological input. We invited all specialists on Pergamon to a 2-week seminar, and then we put up all the knowledge available and handed this over to Assisi. We choose the viewing angle for the panorama. We, of course, wanted to have the Pergamon altar itself very much in the foreground. And so we very rapidly came forward, not just with an idea to create a panorama, we were able to make the thing very precise in a very short time. And then for several years, we worked on the details. That was a very, very laborious task, as you can imagine. And it's also very obvious that there are entire bits of the Acropolis which cannot be properly reconstructed because our archaeological knowledge is too weak. So this had to be filled, so to say, hypothetically. In technical terms, the panorama is a combination of photographs, of drawings, and of painted scenes, all brought together in an incredibly large digital database. And of course, years went into working out the details, and Assisi and his team, they are real masters of this technology. In the end, the picture, the panorama, was printed by a German company specializing on mega posters for public relations on 4-meter wide pieces of a highly special synthetic textile. And these 4-meter wide pieces, they were sewn together, and then the panorama was brought into the building and presented there. It's technically very complicated. You have to avoid folds and things like that. So that's a very short way to explain how the panorama was made. We, of course, produced the panorama not for ourselves because we're happy to see a panorama. We thought that was an excellent means, didactic means, to explain to the public how Pergamon in the 2nd century AD might have looked like. We did not want to have a sterile archaeological view like architects want to have it in gray and white with no people in it. We wanted to make it as lively and instructive as possible. So we choose dozens of different topics from the cultural and religious life of Pergamon to be presented in the panorama. And what you see here is the front of the Pergamon altar facing west towards the Aegean Sea. And you see here, not in great detail, but at least it gives you an idea, the slaughtering of bulls was used. You see that the marble at the center is covered with blood. It gives to contemporary people, I think, quite a realistic idea how animals were killed on very special occasions, that people in antiquity had to kill the animals themselves if they wanted to eat them. And you can have an entire cultural critical discourse on this topic alone. Then we show how the meat was burned on the altar. We show its entire sculptural decoration. We show the visitors. We have a Roman group of tourists here looking at the north frieze of the Pergamon altar. We have hundreds of people enjoying Dionysian festival on the Acropolis. We had to overcome very tricky problems when we went into the details. As you know, the Great Frieze of the Pergamon altar is not preserved in its entirety, so we had to reconstruct at least the north frieze, which is shown here in the panorama. This was a very laborious and, of course, very tricky task, obviously because we couldn't present in our 2nd century view of the city the fragmentary state in which the Great Frieze is now. Here you have a view, again, of the height of the tower and how the panorama is seen from the rooftop of this monumental rotunda. We have already seen this as the first slide. That's one of the most spectacular views of the panorama. We look from the tower towards the Greek theater of Pergamon on this very steep slope facing west, with the Temple of Dionysus to its left, the Temple of Trajan on top, and then here the famous Sanctuary of Athena with the oldest temple of Pergamon, with hundreds of people watching from the Athena terrace into the theater, where actually a theatrical performance is being prepared in all details with the actors on stage, with hundreds of visitors already in the theater, people coming, paying for their tickets, people climbing up the rocks to view the theater for free, and with also Hadrian visiting the city at this very moment. We can also see the famous theater terrace, which gave to the visitors of the theater and the inhabitants and visitors of Pergamon a spectacular view of the west slope of the Acropolis. Here, this is the 2nd highest level. You can see that you have a change of perspective. There is no distortion of the perspective whatsoever from the upper level as soon as you walk down. Of course, you have a little distortion and the picture looks totally distorted when you're standing on the floor of the rotunda. Here we have the Temple of Athena with its altar, with the surrounding stoa, which most likely housed the library, the famous library of the kings of Pergamon, and their collection, the Museion, of which some parts might have been discovered by the excavations, fragments of archaic sculpture, classical sculpture, and very early Hellenistic copies of classical prototypes. Also, as you know, came to Berlin and are part of the show, as we will see later. Of course, it was also good fun to create the panorama. Many of my colleagues appear here in Pergamene dress and can be recognized by their friends and relatives quite easily. As the Great Frieze had to remain for conservational reasons in the Pergamon Museum itself, we choose to display the famous small or telephos frieze in a room which was especially created to present the better preserved parts of the telephos frieze in a quite abstract manner, which alludes, of course, to the courtyard of the Pergamon altar itself. This is a view from the courtyard towards the outside with a highly abstract view of the landscape surrounding Pergamon. This is the second section in the exhibition where we operate with changing light, again, to simulate a day and night situation, showing the beautiful reliefs of the telephos frieze in quite different lighting situations. You see the ceiling here, which behind this filter screen, there are thousands of LEDs which can be computer controlled, and they create a really dense, I think, quite impressive light atmosphere. You can see here the labeling, everything again in German and English, and there are drawings explaining exactly where the individual sculptures, or in this case, the telephos frieze, were actually displayed on the buildings or on the squares of Pergamon. At the very end of the hall, we tried, and Assisi, especially Assisi and his team who created this, tried to recreate the entire Pergamon altar digitally. So we have almost cinema-sized screen on which a 20 minutes film is shown. It starts, as we see here, with the Pergamon altar as it's displayed in the Pergamon Museum itself. You see it from different angles, and then the walls of the museum disappear. The Pergamon Museum altar is completed in its entirety, and then it flies to the top of the Acropolis of Pergamon and is shown there digitally in all conceivable details. You see there are benches. It's quite amazing to see how patiently the visitors, in many cases, watch the entire film of 20 minutes. I was very skeptical about that, but it works well. But we show also further originals here, very beautiful statues in the round from the roof of the Pergamon altar. Here, in this case, a horse belonging to the chariots of the Olympian gods, who were shown on the flat roof of the Pergamon altar, awaiting the battle, which is so beautifully and tellingly displayed in the Great Frieze. And in the foreground, you can see a griffin. This is a general stock of apotropaic figures meant to protect the building itself. This is another screenshot of the digital presentation of the Pergamon altar, which is, as I explained, slowly moving. So the patient visitor gets an excellent idea of how the entire Acropolis, its topography, the views towards the sea, the views toward the mountains, which he has already seen in the static panorama, briefly explained to you. Here the visitor has the chance to see this moving, and he gets a very good idea of the entire architectural setting of the Acropolis of Pergamon, and this all done, with the digital means available to us in 2017, early 2018. You know, things are changing dramatically in that respect, but I think it's still something which can be presented to the public with good confidence. The next section, after we have talked in detail, presented the altar in the panorama and in digital still form, we've explained the telephos frieze. We now move on to the Pergamon Palace district, very, very badly destroyed because it was on the very top of the Acropolis. Only low walls were found there, which give us an idea of the layout of the palaces, but spectacular finds were made within the palaces. You see one to the left-hand side, a lady, the so-called Pergamon dancing girl. She was most likely a silent servant carrying a lamp or a torch to light the palace. And what you see at the center of this slide is an Alma Tadema-like reconstruction of the palace interior, making full use of what was found, its adornments. You see a beautiful Hellenistic Pergamon mosaic on the floor. You see members of the royal court. You see two replicas of the dancing girl and other archaeological finds from Pergamon, which give at least a sense of how the interior of Palace 5, the most lavishly decorated, might have looked like in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. Yeah, the next section is dedicated to the sanctuary of Athena, very prominently displayed in the panorama itself, as we have seen. Here we show some of the most famous things found there. To the left, the Heracles Prometheus group, which was actually attached to the rear wall of the left wing of the Stoa of Athena surrounding the temple. At the center, you see one of the fabulous reliefs showing weapons, Celtic weapons, which the victorious Pergamene troops had taken as spoils in their brutal fights with the invading Celts, Gallic or Gaul tribes coming from southern Germany and southern France, attracted by the wealth of Pergamon, invaded Asia Minor. From the middle of the 3rd century onwards, Pergamon was attacked several times, and in one very fierce battle, the kings and their mercenaries were able to beat the Gauls in front of their city walls. And the Attalid kings had all reason to thank Zeus for being saved from these barbarian tribes. And clearly, this fantastic display of spoils taken from these tribes and shown on the parapet of the Athena Hall, extremely interesting monument displaying this victory. Another even more famous piece is the Athena here, also found in the sanctuary of Athena, clearly alluding to 5th century high classical types, but in a Hellenistic way, so playing with classical forms and classical style. And that was clearly loved by the kings when they adorned their city. As already said, it's quite likely that they collected art which was already seen as old in their high Hellenistic times. You see that there are some different colors are used in the display. All the gods have a golden background. That was one of Athese's ideas. In aesthetic terms, this works, I think, pretty well. Looks a bit like a jewelry shop, but it was not so very easy to display quite different sorts of sculpture in combination with the panorama in a black box hall without any natural lighting, where we could only use these screens to create different rooms, to have rooms with different lighting, creating different atmosphere, and so on. This is another view of famous Heracles Prometheus group. Yeah, here mounted in a rather adventurous, abstract rocky landscape covered by gold. Pergamon. Yeah, as I said, Athene, as a very ambitious artist, he wanted to contribute not just reconstructions in an archaeological sense, he also contributed works of art. Here in a Renaissance manner. He shows different views of the head of Heracles, and he offers different possibilities to reconstruct the complete statue to our visitors. It's meant simply to help them to understand this fragment. I think that was my presentation, and now I have at the very end of it a short film which gives you, I think, a good idea how the panorama can be experienced by the visitor and how the sound also works. Okay, perhaps let me end by saying that it's absolutely impossible in such a short talk to give you a proper idea what the impact of the panorama is on the visitor. It's very monumental. It's static. Most people have never seen such a monumental picture in their life. And many are deeply impressed by the experience. And this does absolutely not transmit via a PowerPoint and a film. So I'm very happy to invite you to have a look at the original. Unfortunately, we had to close for the second time this year because of Corona, at least for November, but we are of course optimistic that we can open again later this year, or definitely in 2021. And of course, my team and I would be very happy to welcome you to Berlin and show you around, not just the panorama, but also all the other displays in the Altes and Neues Museum. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm of course happy to answer your questions.
Wow, thank you, Andreas. That was incredible. It's interesting what you said about COVID, that you just had to close, but in fact, you have been open. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, when I saw it in 2018, of course, it was pre-COVID. And one of the things that they're doing in Rome, probably the best example, was at the Domus Aurea, where they have virtual reality with the goggles, which is also an immersive experience. It is different. As you and I were talking, it's like the Pantheon. You have to experience the Pantheon. You just can't get it otherwise. And I think the Pergamon Panorama is like that. But it's almost like the flip side of the virtual reality with the goggles, because the goggles come to you and you're stationary, whereas when you're in the panorama, you can move, and it's like you are in another world because you are yourself. Although I guess everybody had to have a mask on, but one of the great things about a 30-meter hall is that you can socially distance. So in that sense, the merging of the old and new technology benefited this COVID period in a way, because obviously we can't touch the mechanisms. I thought it would be interesting for people just to see what the whole thing looks like, unwound, as it were. And so this is what is wrapped around the room. But I also wanted to show some details, because one of the interesting things is they did film people, as Andreas said, and I'm sure that I saw Assisi in one of these. But for example, this is Hadrian and Sabina, and presumably that is Antinous there. When you get really close to it, you can actually see that there are real people there, and not just the emperor. Of course, for me, I love the workshops, doing the hides for the parchment, because that's known to be from Pergamon. And another interesting touch I really liked was when you start looking closely, and you can spend a lot of time here, you start to see things like this woman here, and she's obviously a play on the drunken woman. This one's from the Munich Glyptothek, and then one from the Capitoline. And then another one, the Barberini Faun from the Munich Glyptothek, which has been enacted out here. So there's a level of detail here. I mean, there's the experience and the emotion, but there's also an incredible attention to detail. Just things like the perspective on these, like looking down on these people here. And I can just only imagine how difficult it was to compose these scenes so that they all looked appropriate from a single view. Though you do point out that as you get lower down, it gets more distorted. But just from a technological perspective, I think it's just an amazing thing that he's done. And one of the questions that I had for you, in working on this with your colleagues in Assisi, did you find that either from your perspective as a scholar or your perspective as a curator, you came out learning more than you had gone into?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's of course a very, very, very complicated and honestly, in some cases, of course, also a controversial affair. We suggested the topics, the general topics to be shown in the panorama, but as soon as it gets into detail, of course, Assisi and his people had questions which we could not answer. Yeah? So in many cases, we were able, of course, as you have shown, to give him lots of artworks as Hellenistic examples. But in many cases, this was not possible. And one of the problematic aspects of the panorama can be explained quite easily by looking at these pictures. As closer as you get, you see that many scenes are based on photography. And then you get immediately into the aesthetics of the Hollywood historic sandal and sword films, yeah, which I don't like very much. And it was obviously not possible to pay for 4,000 or 5,000 Hellenistic costumes. So we had to take what the Berlin cinema studios had to offer. Yeah, you don't realize that when you stand on the tower because the distance is too far. Everything looks in some way believably Hellenistic. But as soon as you get close, as an archaeologist, you will find horrible mistakes. But this was simply the price we had to pay, yeah, to create these very elaborate scenes. We couldn't, it was impossible. Financially, historically, aesthetically, it was impossible to get Hellenistic authenticity, so to say, into every detail. But I guess this is mainly or only realized and seen by archaeologists. I think the general public will not mind. They will look at the scenes. They will ask why sacrifices were done that way. They will see how a theatrical performance was prepared, how a Roman emperor was received, how a Dionysian festival was celebrated, and many, many, many other stories can be told. And when we did this, we had very strongly in mind that we were doing this, of course, for our fun, but mainly, of course, for the public. And we especially focused on school classes. We looked at curriculum. What are they being taught about Greek antiquity? Where can we connect the panorama and the scenes shown in it to what normal pupil nowadays learn about Greek antiquity? It's not much, but we wanted to interest them in the medium of the panorama and in many details. And the quotations which you have shown there, of course, can be easily used for little children to identify. You give them a photograph of the Munich Barberini faun and ask them to pick it out in the panorama.
The other thing that I think is really interesting about the panorama, particularly at this moment, is that if you look at the historical ones, the few that are left, they usually are of either battles or disasters. I think there was a Chicago fire, or religious scenes. Yet this is a didactic. It's taking a medium and using it for a completely different purpose, in a sense. That it's not heroic battle or the emotion of the disaster, but love the way that you guys have taken it as a way of engaging the public, but engaging them in something a little bit more intellectually challenging than they were used for in the 19th century.
Yeah, and what I found very interesting and what I did not expect initially was that already the first panorama, but also the second, that they have a certain emotional quality which does not come through via a PowerPoint presentation. You have to experience it live, and many people were really touched by this, the static monumentality, the soundtrack, which I don't like personally very much, quite sweet and very much in a Hollywood style, but many people get really attracted by that. And that's what you usually don't achieve in a standard archaeological display, really to address the emotions of the people, to interest them, to offer a new access into the world of antiquity via this monumental illustration. This I found quite interesting, and we wanted to try that.
Yeah, I just showed this other panorama, which is roughly contemporary, a little bit earlier. This is in Constantinople, and this was done after Erdogan took charge, and it was commissioned in 2005 and then put up in 2009. I hear that it's one of the most visited sites in Istanbul, but it is basically a panorama of the 1453 Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. And then I have our friend, for any of those who joined us last time here, Mehmed the Conqueror. But clearly this has a political meaning as well, but it's using the emotion, because I mean, the same thing, they have music from what I understand, and it's using the emotion, but for a political rather than a purely didactical reason, which, you know, I think it's really interesting in this world of virtual reality that we're going back to this technology. And questions. Have there been long lines to enter before COVID? First saw a museum when it was in East Berlin.
When we showed the panorama first, together with the monumental Pergamon exhibition in 2011-12, we had an enormous response from the public. There were 1.5 million people in the Pergamon Museum in that year, from September 11 to December 12, and 900,000 people visited the panorama. But then we had the big advantage that the panorama building itself, which was a little bit smaller than the one now, was in the courtyard of the Pergamon Museum, and it was the first thing you saw. It was pretty ugly, the thing, but it was the first thing you saw when you wanted to enter the Pergamon Museum, and you were almost, you were literally invited to visit it first, and many people did that. Now the building is only, let's say, 250 meters away, but it turns out that it's not so easy to tell people who visit the still open bit, the south wing of the Pergamon Museum with the Near Eastern and with the Islamic collection, that they should walk several hundred meters to visit that as well. Then, as always in our institution, we do beautiful things, but we don't have the money for public relations. That's a big problem, which we haven't actually solved in this case. We spent so much money on building the hall and the panorama that there was nothing left for public relations, which is quite bad. So by now, the figures have not been as high as I expected them to be. And now in the COVID situation, our visitor numbers went down to 10% of the normal. No international tourism, almost no national visitors, only the Berliners and the people living in the province of Brandenburg around Berlin. So that's quite bad in many respects.
When I went in 2018, I didn't know what it was. Someone in Berlin said, "Oh, you should go see this." And then when I came back and I mentioned it to people in Rome all the time, and no one has heard of it. So I think you do have a public relations problem there, because it's really an amazing thing, but I don't think enough people know about it, which is one reason that I wanted to have you come talk about it, because it is a really amazing thing.
Yeah, we are a state-run institution, and flexibility is not our first virtue.
Right. So we have time for maybe one more question. There's one here from Dorian Bourbonis. I appreciate the problem of navigating the boundaries of knowledge in order to create a public display. My question is whether this need has also forced Andreas Scholl and his colleagues to think about new questions that simply had not come up in the academic discourse that we are normally engaged in.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Of course, the panorama brought us to think about many topics related to Pergamon we hadn't probably thought of before. And we learned actually a lot from the first panorama, which was criticized for offering a view of antiquity too academic, too clean, too, in a sense, unrealistic. So we were not accused, but people rightly criticized that the dark sides of antiquity, which is certainly one of the very dark sides of Greek and Roman civilization, was not visible in the first panorama. And we learned a lot from this, from public criticism, and we tried to adopt this and to react to this criticism in the second version. Perhaps not in any case successfully, but we tried hard to learn from what we had heard in terms of commentaries from the general public, and also, of course, from colleagues when we showed the first panorama.
So I think we should probably end it now, but I just want to thank you so much for this. It's been really excellent, and I hope that once we can all start traveling again, that people will go to Berlin and see the Pergamon Panorama, because it really is an awesome thing. I have to admit that when my husband and I came out, we sort of looked at each other and said, wow, that was better than the real thing. Which I suppose we should not say, but it really is a very, very powerful thing. So thank you very much for this. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark Robbins now to end us.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Lynn. And it is a Gesamtkunstwerk. It does talk to the power of art, sometimes to impress us beyond reality. Reminds us of Piranesi's drawings of Rome, which Goethe famously said, it destroyed seeing Rome. But it was so phenomenal and so theatrical. But I'm so looking forward to being able to travel and seeing the installation in place. And thank you, Lynn, for showing the detail shots, and Andreas for what must have been remarkably detailed work over many, many years. So thank you for your work for the entire scholarly community. It's a great resource. So with that, I just wanted to thank you again for coming and let you know of a few upcoming programs that we have. Giovanna Silva, an Italian fellow in 2020, will be speaking. She's the Enel Fellow in Architecture, Urban Design, and Landscape Architecture. And we have a conversation, that'll be November 9th. And on November 23rd at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll have film critic A.O. Scott in conversation with Garrett Bradley. Looking forward to that, filmmaker and fellow last year. And then we will end this series of programs appropriately now with Lynne Lancaster in her talk, Rome, Pensilis, a hanging city and its hanging gardens. And so we're looking forward to that. Lynn, please join us for all of these programs. And again, thank you to Andreas and Lynn for putting this program together.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.